It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce Nicholas Dujmovic. We've known each other for nearly 20 years. We taught together at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. We were there at the same time for 3 years and had offices near each other and talked a lot about politics and current events during that time and the vagaries of the Coast Guard as well. And also, I had the delightful pleasure to travel to the Soviet Union with him in 1990. This was March of 1990, when the Baltic states were attempting to separate, and there was the whole system was very much in flux. It was a fascinating time to be there. After that, we wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Christian Science Monitor about our travels in the Soviet Union, particularly their monetary woes. Nick has been a valued colleague and friend for many years. I'm just delighted that he's agreed to come and speak again. He was here 10 years ago. Some of the buildings have changed since then, parking garages and that sort of thing. Let me give the standard bio now. He joined the CIA in 1990 as a Soviet analyst. He speaks Russian, or did at the time, and he says he's not as good at it now. During his career at the CIA, he has been a team leader for Indonesia. He's been a speechwriter for two directors of the CIA, John Deutsch and George Tenet. He has been the editor for the President's Daily Brief. That's the news that the President gets about intelligence every day. And currently he's an historian for the CIA. And so in addition to other things, he teaches new employees at the CIA about the history of the CIA. He is a part of an office that is responsible for providing insight on the history of the CIA and hopefully lessons that are learned from that history. Prior to working at the CIA, he was an officer in the U.S. Coast Guard. In fact, he commanded a patrol boat at one time, taught at the Coast Guard Academy, National Security Policy, American Government. He earned a bachelor's degree at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, beginning his government service, and he also has a Ph.D. from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Interesting fact about him, he's a lay reader in his Orthodox parish in Northern Virginia. He is a very devout Russian Orthodox. He is married. He and his wife, Kathy, have two sons, one who's 7 years old and one 2. And they have agreed to allow him to come and spend some time with us on this trip. And I'm just grateful that they're willing to do that. So it's a delight to introduce Nicholas Dujmovic.
I hope I can live up to that. Thank you, Richard. I understand we have an hour more or less. I know people need to leave at 10 of for class. You won't insult me if you have to leave for another engagement. I will try to move smartly through my presentation to leave time for questions at the end. It is a PowerPoint presentation, and I know that PowerPoint has been described as the enemy of thought. We like it in the government. You can draw your own conclusions about that. But I'm from the government, and I'm here to inflict PowerPoint on you. What I want to do today, first of all, is to talk about what it is a CIA historian does. And then not only to tell you how we regard our own history, but to show you in a way, well, I hope you suspend the disbelief that you might have. Before that, I want to say that organizationally, the CIA history staff is part of the Center for the Study of Intelligence, an independently minded, if not quite independent, organization within the Central Intelligence Agency. We like to say that we are in CIA, but not entirely of CIA. It's a small staff with a lot of professional intelligence expertise, as well as advanced degrees in history and other things. We teach, it's not quite like being at a college campus in terms of the teaching load. but we do teach, as Richard mentioned, all the incoming folks. More on that later. Our flagship course is a 25-hour course over 11 weeks on the history of the agency for currently serving officers. It is a classified course. On request, we will do specialized briefings on the legacy of OSS, what works in operations and what doesn't. We turn out armloads of publications, all of which are available, again, to our cleared community on our classified website. And there are some unclassified treatments that we've done that are available on our public website, cia.gov. And we have a robust oral history program that I have the pleasure of running. We produce, as I said, articles and monographs. Studies in Intelligence just celebrated its 50th year of presenting the best thinking within the community. Every other issue now is unclassified, so we have a larger readership than we used to when it was just the closed classified world. Monographs like the one on the right are sort of our stock and trade. This one deals with a particular analytic problem that we faced during the Vietnam War. I have to say it's marked secret, but the cover isn't. The contents are. We do book-length histories. The tome on the left, 500 pages, done by our chief historian, David Robarge, on the directorship of John McCone, who served Presidents Kennedy and Johnson during very, very critical time in American Cold War history. On the right, you see a focused, very much shorter monograph on how we handled an intelligence policy dispute over Haiti in 1993. The answer is badly. The title is, Trainwreck. We can talk about that. Now, some people take a cynical view of history. The cynicism increases when you're talking about government staff historians. I tell people, yes, I'm a CIA historian. I get this knowing glance. Yeah, you're there to pretty things up, aren't you? Well, not really. There's a quote from Sherman Kent. He was a Yale historian who became a senior CIA officer and helped to establish the analytic discipline within CIA. He had a realistic view of what CIA historians ought to do. This is not history for its own sake. This is to make things better. We don't make history better. We try to improve our actual operations. We're not here, in other words, for propaganda, morale building, indoctrination, organizational socialization. We do some of those things, but that's not what we're here for. We have to face, we CIA officers have to face our history as it really is or was. If we do that, if we're aware of the real history, warts and all, then we at least have a better chance of trying to figure out the present and to do better in the future at what it is we do. That's our role, and it's important. If intelligence is being the truth tellers when it really counts, we are the truth tellers to the truth tellers. And sometimes we even have fun with it occasionally. We did this for Family Day. Your tax dollars at work. I have no idea where they got the model for that head. Okay. Now, the conceit I'm asking you to participate in is that we're going to pretend that all of you are new at CIA. This is your first week of indoctrination, orientation I should call it. And the class is about this size, so this looks familiar to me. And it's your fourth day, and you've been sworn in, you've taken the oath of office, you've learned about the current missions, the directorates that make up CIA, you've learned where the bathrooms are, where the cafeteria, the food court, and where the credit union is, very important. You've talked substance and everything, but now we dig a little deeper, and you get me to talk about the legacy, the history, the heritage. The difference today is that what you hear is necessarily going to be unclassified, but I didn't have to change it very much. There are some classified details that I can't talk about here. But this is basically what you will hear. I will move more quickly through it because of the time constraint. One of the things I like to start with is the fact that we have to get used to being in the news. Okay, and I start with a quote from the New York Times. It's a piece written on intelligence, one of the weakest links in our security. Thank you. America's first line of defense, a worldwide intelligence service, is today one of the weakest links in our national security. Friction has been pronounced between various intelligence agencies of government, notably between the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department and the FBI and so forth. There is unnecessary duplication and overlapping. At the same time, there are serious omissions of intelligence, and there is considerable expensive empire building. The result today is a marked depreciation in the quantity and quality of our intelligence. Many of the estimates by different government agencies are conflicting, so widely divergent in some cases that they are impossible to reconcile. These facts, a growing sense of frustration and discouragement among some intelligence personnel, which has led to resignations from CIA of some of the best personnel, and several intelligence fiascos have brought about an investigative survey of the whole intelligence structure of government. If this survey is to achieve its purpose, it must inevitably lead, in the opinion of those who have studied our intelligence agencies closely, to major personnel changes in our intelligence agencies, to some reorganizational and perhaps functional modifications, and to insistence upon better cooperation between all intelligence agencies. Obviously, this is a loaded question, but when do you think this was? This could be from 2002, could be from 1992. People know something about CIA history, say, time of troubles, 1970s. Well, this is from July 20th, 1948. The agency's 10 months old. So, puts things into perspective. We start with three main premises that frame our history. First of all, intelligence as an organization, as an institution, as product, and as people involves the pursuit or support of what I call the four classic functions of intelligence. And you can read as well as I can. Collection, analysis, counterintelligence, and covert action. These things are typically what a full-service intelligence organization throughout history will do. Now, these are not trifling tasks. Our profession seeks to reveal what is hidden, most often deliberately by people who mean us harm. We seek to ascertain trends and predict the future audaciously. We push the bounds of science and technology to collect what otherwise would not be collectible and therefore unknowable. We push the limits of human ingenuity and courage in old-fashioned spying and counterespionage. Make no mistake, this stuff is hard. This stuff is hard to do. And by the way, the theory behind central intelligence is that it's a little easier to do if you have these things under one roof, because they are interconnected. Second premise, key to understanding what we're about is recognizing that this is a very human activity. This is our wall of honor with the 80, that says 83, but there are now 84 stars of CIA officers who have lost their lives in the pursuit of their mission. In our history, you will find, in the pursuit of these intelligence functions, genuine brilliance, audacity, risk-taking, patriotism, incredible insights, intellectual insights, faithfulness, all the human virtues you can think of. But, there's always a but. CIA officers, contrary to what you see in Hollywood movies, are not superhuman. We are fallible human beings. We make mistakes. Sometimes in our history, we even display some of the vices of the human condition. Pettiness, arrogance to the point of hubris, small-mindedness, the occasional abject stupidity. It's not always pretty, but it's real. It's reality. That is the human condition. One of the stars on our wall, just to show that the human condition is also a very frail one, is that of one of our station chiefs who was murdered back in 1975. Third premise, before we really get into it, if the tasks are very difficult, and they are, and the human condition is fallible, we make mistakes, and we do, then it is inexorably inevitable that we will see intelligence failures. There will be failures. I don't know why this is so hard for people to understand. U.S. intelligence history is defined and bracketed by two major failures, of course, Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 attacks. Now, it's absolutely crucial to remember that failure, because it is going to happen, needs to be transformational. It needs to change things for the better. This is where we come in. It's history that we turn to for lessons, and many of these lessons do result from failure. Now, one thing we always like to point out is that intelligence history does not begin in 1947 with the creation of CIA. In modern American culture, of course, the profession of intelligence has been treated with suspicion, unease, the conviction it's somehow abnormal, and of course it's as old as human society. I always like to point out in this quotation from the book of Numbers in the Old Testament that the Lord said to Moses. I should try to collect, the instances of divinely ordained professions. Carpentry clearly is one. But here we go. The Lord said. From prehistory and throughout human history, intelligence is ubiquitous, whether we're talking about Sun Tzu, ancient Chinese strategist writing in the 6th century BC, or 2,000 years later, Elizabethan England. I always like to point out that Elizabeth in her gown here has little eyes and ears sewn in. In our own history, we have the shining example of George Washington, supreme practitioner of intelligence. He really did it all, the first real director of Central Intelligence. But after him, and we could spend a lot of time on this, but after him, we get a little naive about things. The bottom quotation by Henry Stimson is well known. Gentlemen do not read each other's mail. Well, actually they do. The typically American attitude that intelligence is somehow immoral and always strange persists. It's amazing to me that Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University, the only U.S. president with a Ph.D., it came to him as a surprise that European countries spied on each other. This wouldn't happen in other countries, I assure you. It takes the shock of war, of course, to really get intelligence on a right footing in America. Intelligence that is very fragmented. There's nobody connecting the dots, to use post-9/11 parlance. And FDR sees this as a problem. Essentially, we need to catch up with the rest of the world. In our various courses, we do spend a lot of time on our full-service legacy organization, the OSS. OSS did it all. Paramilitary, unconventional warfare, all-source analysis, particularly for bombing, espionage, developing technical tools of the trade. People like organizations turn out as a result of a mixture of nature and nurture, the origins and the environment. If we can speak of the DNA of an organization, this is where we get our genetic code in CIA. So we pay a lot of attention to OSS. I apologize for this particular data-filled slide, but my point here is that in the 5 years before the creation of CIA, you have 3 legacy organizations, some of them overlapping. OSS, Office of Strategic Services, wartime organization. The remnants of it, the Strategic Services Unit in the War Department immediately after the war. And then by the time Harry Truman figured out that actually he does need a peacetime intelligence organization, with a stroke of the pen he creates CIG, the Central Intelligence Group, in early 46. And I bring this up because, we are today in a transition period with the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. More on that later. CIA is established formally, legally, with the National Security Act of 1947. I'd like to point out a couple things here. First, CIA was the first, and to my knowledge, the only intelligence organization whose birth was public, a public act. Stan, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's still the case. Secondly, CIA was created as a part of a tapestry, a real fabric of national security organizations, not ever intended to be a lone ranger on its own. This is the National Security Act, just to remind you, also created the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Air Force. It was a confusing period, this period leading up to the actual creation of CIA. I'd like to talk about Douglas McKiernan. This is actually the first time a CIA person has ever spoke in public about Doug McKiernan. and you'll see why shortly. His case illustrates the confusion of the period. He was an Army weather officer serving in far northwestern China, Xinjiang province, during and immediately after the war. And he wanted to stay there to continue serving his country. The Strategic Services Unit was interested in his skills, so he signed up. He returned to the United States in early 47 for training, and then went back to China, only to find out that on the way, SSU didn't exist. It was absorbed into CIG, the Central Intelligence Group. The point is, it didn't matter. The mission was the same. The mission to be our man in northwest China. He was stationed in Urumqi, also known as Tiwa, up here in Xinjiang province. A critically important area. He's the only American intelligence officer for 1,000 miles in a region of strategic significance. He's close to the USSR and especially its atomic testing range across the border in Kazakhstan. He's in China undergoing a communist revolution. And while he's there, the initials change again. CIG becomes CIA. But again, the mission stays the same. His job is unchanged by what goes back on in Washington. Unfortunately, McKiernan had to abandon his work as the communist revolution forced him out. He had to escape over desert, plateau, and mountain. He was accidentally killed by a Tibetan border patrol in April of 1950, the first CIA officer killed in the line of duty, and the first star on our memorial wall. His example is important for us intelligence officers because it demonstrates the necessity of remaining focused on your mission and not paying too much attention to what the initials are of your organization and the wiring diagrams and all that. And the case also illustrates, for better or for worse, the secrecy that pervades our organization. It's only this year, after 56 years, that we've been able to mention Doug McKiernan in our Book of Honor, which is near the wall and available for anybody who visits CIA to see. There are blanks for various years where we lost people. People always speculate, okay, who are those? This was blank until this year, Doug McKiernan. Back to Washington. In other political systems, particularly non-democratic ones, the position of intelligence chief of a country is one of vast power, and that person is usually feared. In the American system, he's usually struggling to be heard, and with good reason. In CIA's early years, military men were put in charge of this new CIG to CIA transition, mostly to give Central Intelligence a credibility that it otherwise would not have. Even so, these are not very senior officers. I like to point out to my good friend who went to Fletcher with me, Rear Admiral Frank Pandolf, that these Rear Admirals are, dime a dozen in Washington. After 1950, in fact, these are all the directors, you will not see in CIA history a director who was an active duty military officer till the very end, till the current incumbent director. He likes to be called Mike, but I think people like to call him General Hayden. I say DCIs and two DCIAs. We'll talk about this a little bit. With Porter Goss, the Intelligence Reform Act ended the title of Director of Central Intelligence and created the position of Director of Central Intelligence Agency, which had not been a formal title. Our history suggests that it does in fact matter who is at the top, who the director is. It's been a very difficult job. Nobody ever gets it right completely, and some have been more successful than others. Along those lines, as I said, from 1947, the National Security Act of 47, the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, was in charge both of CIA and nominally of the intelligence community. This chart, in other words, had CIA at the center. But it didn't work very well. The DCI had no real power over other intelligence community agencies, most of which, of course, because they belonged to the military and the Secretary of Defense. This responsibility for leading the IC changed in 2005 with the Intelligence Reform Act. When the DNI was created, he's now at the center. And I have to say that the authority that the DNI has over the intelligence community, including those military organizations, has not yet been fully tested. And much remains to be seen. You'll notice that I've kind of departed from the chronology here to go on a thematic jag. But I think it's important to note a critical factor in the agency's success in its history is the relationship between the nation's chief intelligence officer and the president. It's absolutely critical for us to recognize that because intelligence, that we collect and analyze intelligence so that policymakers who like to be reelected can make better decisions, inevitably politics and personalities will affect how we do our business. The agency speaks truth to power, and that's not always appreciated. As the photograph suggests, our influence downtown has waxed and waned over the years. A few DCIs were close to their presidents, William Casey with Ronald Reagan, and more recently George Tenet with George Bush. Some had, at best, business-like relations, like John McCone with President Johnson. Some had infrequent contact and dealt mainly with the National Security Advisor, as Admiral Stansfield Turner, cutting up here, did with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was obviously Carter's National Security Advisor. Some directors had no relationship to speak of, and Jim Woolsey immediately comes to mind. When presidents regard CIA directors as their principal intelligence advisors, they listen to us and we have clout. When they don't treat the directors that way, or if they don't like what the directors are bringing them in the way of intelligence, has been hard for directors to even get in the door of the Oval Office. All the agency's directors have faced that dilemma, what Director Helms called the problem of keeping the game honest and yet staying at the table. We'll get more to that when we talk about Vietnam. Another thing about presidents and CIA, they don't always like our analysis. Indeed, we're often doing our job because they don't like the analysis. But often they ignore the analysis, but there's another CIA function they can't seem to do without, and that is covert action. Every president since Truman, I always like to repeat this, every president since Truman has sooner or later turned to CIA to do covert action, to implement his foreign policy in a way that the hand of the United States is not evident. And here we have various kinds, covert influence like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, regime change, paramilitary stuff. Again, we could talk a long time about this. Back to chronology, it's because of covert action that the agency develops a good reputation in the 1950s. Old-timers remember it as the golden age, when CIA had bipartisan and popular support, was respected as a patriotic, can-do organization on the front lines of this Cold War, which people took very seriously. People today often view certain covert actions from that period, particularly Iran and Guatemala, as failures because of the domestic and foreign policy consequences over many years thereafter, but it's important to realize that at the time these were considered great successes. And not just in covert action during the 50s, but in a whole range of activities, CIA is considered a successful organization. Mentioned RFE and RL, Popov and Penkovsky were two very important Soviet assets, spies for us. They were absolutely critical to our understanding of the Soviet threat. Collection systems like the U-2 and follow-on systems like satellites. And we'll talk about analytic work on the USSR. There were a whole series of covert operations during this period, however, that did not go well and perhaps should not have been attempted. I'll speak of one that I know something about. In late 1952, during the Korean War, remember the Chinese had entered the war on North Korea's side, there was a mission, a C-47 twin-engine aircraft crossed into Chinese airspace, Manchuria, to pick up an agent, a CIA agent, part of an ethnic Chinese team that we had inserted the previous summer. This is November of '52. In the rear of the aircraft, there were two young officers, both recent college graduates, Richard Fecto from BU, not BYU, BU, and John Downey of Yale. The system used for the kind of exfiltration of an agent that they were attempting is shown in this 1944 Army Air Corps manual. Basically, the aircraft comes in low and slow, very low and slow, with a hook to snatch a line that's between these two poles. The line is attached to a harness that's on a man on the ground. Yeah, I wouldn't want to do this either. But we actually, tested this sort of thing. Downey and Fecto were in the rear of the aircraft. They were assigned to be the winchmen to haul this guy in midair back into the aircraft. Unfortunately, it was a trap. The team had been caught, like most of our teams at that period, had been turned by the opposition. Chinese soldiers were waiting for the C-47, and it was a great target. They shot it down. Both pilots died in the crash. Downey and Fecto survived, but they were caught, arrested, imprisoned, and Fecto finally was released in 1971. That's 19 years in Chinese prisons. Downey in 1973. The case demonstrates that our work involves high stakes, that operational mistakes have huge consequences. These men should not have been assigned to that overflight. It was a screw up. But it also shows the power of the human spirit. These men endured. They came back with no bitterness, and they've led productive lives ever since. They continue to identify themselves as agency men. I think it's a remarkable story of endurance and hope. I also use this case with junior officers to kind of put their own problems in perspective. These guys can survive 20 years in Chinese prisons. If you've got a jerk for a boss for a year, you can deal with it. Another great story of a CIA success from the 50s is the development of the U-2, which was a partnership between CIA technicians and private industry, in this case Lockheed. President Eisenhower realized the importance of acquiring strategic intelligence on the Soviet Union. And from the time he approved the project, only 8 months passed before there was a prototype. Now, these days, a contract would take 8 months to write. But we had a prototype flying in 8 months, and then by mid-1956, the U-2 was flying over the Soviet Union, providing us with $1 million imagery. This is what we would pay an asset for this information, but we could get this from overhead. This added immeasurably to our understanding of what the Soviets could do, and more important, what they couldn't do. I'm often asked what CIA's greatest accomplishment is historically. And it's something for which there are no monuments or plaques, but it's simply the day in, day out, year in, year out monitoring what the Soviets were up to, what they could do, what they couldn't do. But we don't have holidays for that. We helped keep the Cold War cold. It's in the 60s that our reputation, the bloom comes off the rose. CIA becomes more known for its failures than for its successes. And this is true in part because when you have a success, you want to reproduce it. If you want it to be reproducible, you better keep it secret. We did have some well-known successes. We warned of the first Chinese nuclear test in 1964. We called the outcome of the Six-Day War, more on that later. But this was not enough to overcome the perception brought on by spectacular failures like Bay of Pigs, the shoot down of the U-2, and so forth. I'm going to focus on the Vietnam situation because that sort of dominated the decade. And this may be a morality play for today. Like many presidents, Lyndon Johnson had no prior experience with or exposure to intelligence and didn't really understand it. As vice president, he did not get the president's daily brief. Like a few other presidents, Johnson did not see intelligence primarily as true or false, likely or unlikely, or even objective or biased. He saw it in terms of whether it helped or hurt his policies. This is not good. If you start from the premise that the policy is right and any intelligence contrary to it must be wrong and therefore discounted, it's a recipe for disaster. CIA's analysis on Vietnam, which we stuck to despite pressure, said that there were more of the enemy than the military was counting, that the enemy was tenacious, that our South Vietnamese allies were not, they were ineffective, and that the bombing campaign wasn't working. All this flew in the face of more optimistic views that the White House had coming from State Department and the Pentagon. Director Helms found himself uninvited to the White House, and CIA was isolated, criticized, and seemingly irrelevant. The lesson here, though, is that analytic integrity is more important than access and influence. Because if you compromise your integrity in order to gain influence, in the end, obviously you will have neither. In any case, when under fire, keep your cool. Opportunities for success will arise. When Mideast tensions, as they always do, arose in the spring of 1967, Israel appealed to the United States for help. Johnson asked CIA, if the Arab states combine in an attack, can Israel win by itself? And our answer, we've been monitoring this for a long time, came back within 24 hours and said yes. And he didn't ask for it, but we gave him an estimate, 7 to 9 days. This was bold, based on solid analytic tradecraft, continuous monitoring, and in response to an urgent question from the president. It doesn't get better than this, because we were right. As a result of the call that we made, the U.S. did not help Israel, and as you know, Israel won the Six-Day War in less than a week. Johnson was impressed with what CIA could do for him, made him look good. Director Helms found himself included in the famous Tuesday lunches, the high-level deliberations at the White House. This was an important achievement for CIA, a very much a needed success. Instead of Matt Damon or Jennifer Garner, this is what most CIA people look like. Okay. Now this sets the stage for a story of a real CIA success. This man, George Carver, he kind of looks like a cross between Sam Nunn and Marty Feldman. I know I'm dating myself there. He's a genuine hero. He was the DCI's special assistant on Vietnam analysis, SAVA. He was the point man for all the bad news the agency was trying to deliver on Vietnam. In late 1967 and early 1968, things weren't going well in Vietnam. He conducted a series of briefings with the president's top advisors, these wise men. The message was, you can't win this, and let me tell you why. Johnson's advisors initially were reluctant, but then they were persuaded. And they went to Johnson to say, CIA tells us, and we agree, it's time to get out of Vietnam. Now, I can't prove it, but Johnson, I think, probably remembered that CIA had been right on the Mideast War and wanted to hear what that analysis on Vietnam was. What we do know is that where he had been dismissive about our Vietnam analysis, all of a sudden he wanted to hear it. And George Carver got 75 minutes with the President of the United States. As it's told, Johnson did not like what he was hearing, but he didn't interrupt, and at the end he jumped up, shook Carver's hand, and left the room. 3 days later, Johnson goes on national TV and says, I will not run for re-election, but try to find a way out of the Vietnam situation. This is influence. This is speaking truth to power. This is what we do when we're at our best. Don't like to dwell on the 70s, more than disco and strange clothes, but because it was without a doubt our worst decade. There's been a lot of criticism about the agency in recent years, failure to warn about 9/11, the Iraqi WMD thing, the debate over rendition and interrogation of suspected terrorists, and so forth. Some of the criticism, I think, is fair, some is not. But I always like to remind people that as bad as it gets now, it was not like the 70s. We might have been abolished. Now, time permits me only to say that certain past CIA activities authorized by the President came to light. Certain covert actions, surveillance of U.S. citizens, these things were at least questionable, legally, morally, or both. The agency underwent painful investigations and accusations by members of Congress. It was a tough time. There was media treatment we didn't care for. We in intelligence shouldn't care too much about what the media is saying about this, but it's hard to ignore when the agency is being dragged through the mud, justly or not. In 1976, Jimmy Carter ran for president, inveighing against what he called the three national disgraces: Vietnam, Watergate, and CIA. Thanks, Jimmy. It was a very low time for us. But the upshot, I think, is a very good development. The silver lining that comes out of this: Congress sets up permanent select oversight committees on intelligence. And people sometimes are surprised to hear a CIA person say this, but this is a very good thing. A cynic would say this is co-option. But the reality is that a Congress that is better informed about our activities is more likely to support them. These days we provide Capitol Hill with about 1,000 briefings per year. It's a very close relationship. And I'm going to say parenthetically that, yes, CIA is an executive agency, works for the president, but who's gotten us into more trouble? Presidents or the Congress. Now moving into the 1980s and closer to the present, I find there are fewer things I can safely talk about. In any case, the events are too recent for a historian to be comfortable, and I'm running out of time. So let me just say that it is our view that the CIA helped put an end to the Cold War. It's true, yes, that the Soviet Union was tottering on its own without any help, but we like to think we gave it a few good kicks. One of those, very important kick, was the so-called covert action in Afghanistan. I say so-called because it was overt in practice, the largest covert action we've ever mounted. This clearly placed great strain on Soviet society. I also like to point out that one of the many mythologies from that period is that somehow we are responsible for bin Laden, that he was somehow our guy, one of our guys in Afghanistan. It's absolutely not true. We dealt with Afghans, not foreigners. An even bigger and more pervasive myth from this period is that somehow we missed the impending collapse of the Soviet Union. It's true we did not, because nobody can, predict specific times and outcomes. But our analysts for a long time were monitoring the decline of the USSR, warned policymakers about it. From early on, these warnings became more frequent as the end neared. Robert Gates, who served on the NSC staff, later became DCI, and I understand will be the new Secretary of Defense. It's amazing to me. It's a good thing. Robert Gates said that the 2 years of warning that President Bush, the elder, got were 2 years more than Soviet leader Gorbachev got. He was surprised. We weren't. Okay, getting to the end. In our 11-week course on the history of CIA, I speak for 90 minutes on the 1990s, and that's not enough. In 10 seconds, let me just say that it was a time of immense transition, facing up to the challenges of the post-Cold War world. It's not true, this is this message here, it's not true, as the media kept reporting, and keeps reporting, that CIA officers were wandering the halls of Langley, in a daze, wondering, who to hate now. Soviets are gone, I don't know what to do. It's rather insulting. We had missions in mind. There was a lot of retooling to do, no doubt. Our current director, General Hayden, says that we went in the Cold War from an intelligence situation where the bad guys were easy to find. On the North German plain, the tanks are easy to find, but hard to kill. Whereas now we're on the global war on terror, the bad guys are easy to kill, but they're really hard to find. And by kill, I don't necessarily mean that literally. Which leads us to 9/11, a major intelligence failure, no doubt about it. A transformational one. The effects of this are still being worked out in the intelligence community. 9/11 was a failure, but not for want of trying. It's clear that maybe we lacked focus on specific areas that in hindsight are perfectly clear. Perhaps we weren't aggressive enough. It's been said we weren't imaginative enough. But we were on the job. We knew the general threat that bin Laden posed to Americans. It wasn't enough to clue us onto the specific threat. We were essentially hampered by aspects of the intelligence community that the National Security Act back in 1947 was supposed to fix after Pearl Harbor. But that are inadequate for a modern terrorist threat. CIA was created as an antidote to foreign threats with no power to address domestic ones. So when the foreign threat is here, we have a problem. And it's clear that information did not flow as it should have between CIA and FBI. But it does raise a question. What the heck does central mean in Central Intelligence Agency? We're still living with that question. This is where we turn the telescope around and try to go from the landscape of the past to peer a little bit into the future. What does it hold for us? And I always like to say I'm a historian, I'm not a fortune teller. But it seems to me we will probably continue with a CIA that, I mean, just face it, is diminished since the creation of the DNI. But we're still trying to be central. We remain the only agency in the intelligence community that does all the four classic functions of intelligence. So in that sense, we still are central. Another possible outcome, and it would not be wise to ignore it because it keeps coming up, is this what I call vivisection. We take parts of the pie and divide it up. Analysis is a separate agency. We put covert action with the military. Humans might go somewhere else, or it might stay with us. So spinning these functions away. Or another scenario, somebody figures out that the DNI needs its own agency, and the CIA is reborn as the National Intelligence Agency under the DNI, and we start again. Whatever happens, our history indicates that we will have our ups and downs as an agency, but the intelligence mission remains, whatever the wiring diagram says. It does suggest that two of our most important virtues we could cultivate are flexibility and patience. But whatever happens, the essentials of intelligence will remain important to our security as a nation, so we should strive to be as dedicated to our mission as Doug McKiernan was, have the courage, endurance, and patience of Richard Fecto and John Downey, and preserving our integrity while speaking truth to power, like George Carver. And I am almost to 50 minutes. I always like to say that, as a profession, intelligence, like other professions, has a recommended reading list. These are four of my favorites. And I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions. Do you want to see the reading list again? I can go back. Yeah. The agency is 1986. President's Eyes Only is 1995. Evan Thomas, late 90s. Ray Klein, that's pretty. There's nothing that's entirely current, but I understand that Tim Weiner of the New York Times is coming out with another CIA history. That'll be interesting. Yes, sir.
Question about 9/11.
Yeah. Too recent.
And one book that I read talked about that the major failure of it was a lot of information gathering, which was great, but that the analysts were very few and far in between. Would you say that was one of the large problems with 9/11?
In hindsight, it's always evident where you should have had resources. I like to note that on September 10th, 2001, we had exactly 1.5 analysts assigned to Afghanistan. In retrospect, you think, well, gosh, how dumb is that? But on September 10th, that was what was done. Smart people considered that enough. There are always going to be, hindsight solutions. But yeah, I think in general your comment is a good one. A lot of data out there. No one really connecting the dots as should have been done. Part of this is because we're a foreign intelligence organization, and what Moussaoui is doing with his flight school out wherever it was not something that was immediately normally accessible to us. Now, it should have been, yes. And the emerging structure of the community is trying to fix that. We have the National Counterintelligence Center, NCTC, which is supposed to bridge all these gaps. Yeah.
Hold on a second. Can you use the microphone, please?
I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about the movie coming out with Matt Damon about the birth of the CIA, or if you.
Is that The Good Shepherd?
Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently, there's going to be a conference here in March on how close film and fiction gets to the reality of intelligence. That'll be very useful. I hope to come. I've not seen it. In general, and I think we talked about this in an earlier session, I was in my car going to work, listening to NPR and listening to commentary on Flags of Our Fathers. People seen Flags of Our Fathers, Clint Eastwood movie about Iwo Jima? And they had the chief historian of the U.S. Marine Corps commenting very usefully, positively, about it. And so I asked a question at work, hey, why can't we do that? We got this movie coming out. And the answer, which I should have anticipated, is that when Clint Eastwood makes a movie about the Marine Corps, he's trying to get it right. But I'm not aware of an intelligence movie that really tried to get it right. They probably exist. So, the military would find things just beneath contempt in order to comment. And for us, like 3 Days of the Condor or Mission Impossible, I'm just, don't waste my time. It's fantasy. They're not interested in getting it right because a lot of intelligence is boring. It's sifting information. Yes, sir.
The Chinese have symposiums on the American bombing of their Belgrade embassy. Are you at liberty to say what the story was, what really happened?
I can offer my opinion for what it's worth. I had a grad school professor who worked in the Johnson White House, and he said that in his experience, if you can explain something, if your choices are conspiracy or idiocy, always opt for idiocy. And I think in this case it was a huge screw up. No, I don't think. From what I know about the organization and how these things are done, I do not think that was, in any way a covert action. I think it was an honest and regrettable screw up. It certainly caused problems for the policymakers. If it had been really something deliberate, I think I would have seen a different response internally. We'll probably be doing a study on it. I mean, we're not afraid of the Haiti train wreck thing. So in my experience, and I don't have any real data, but just my knowledge of the organization, how it works, I don't think there was anything deliberate about that. It was just idiocy. Shouldn't have been on the list. But, maps get out of date very easily. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, for most of the public, we don't have a lot of access to some of the things to know about the Central Intelligence Agency.
And you shouldn't.
Yeah, and I agree. So what would you suggest the best way for a public to be informed enough to have an opinion and not be too influenced by a media that might want to construe the Central Intelligence Agency as something that it's not?
Take Stan Taylor's class. That's a perennial problem. I have long argued that we should add to the 4 classic functions of intelligence. For an intelligence service serving a democracy, we need to have something that encompasses openness, tell the things we can tell. That's part of why I'm here. As I like to say, I push the envelope on getting this thing cleared. Okay, and I'm very gratified by no changes. I had to censor myself. I knew there were some things that I shouldn't mention for various good reasons. But we do tend to overclassify things. We do tend to, but people like Alan Dulles used to say, let's tell the things that don't need to be secret anymore, as long as we're not talking about reproducing results. We have an Office of Public Affairs. We have a website, again, CIA.gov, which is, I think, unique in the world for an intelligence service. It's just, you can find out more about CIA than you can about the IRS and how it works. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering about your receptivity within the agency. Are they interested in learning the lessons of history? What kind of access do you have within the agency?
Oh, I don't exactly have the special card that gets me into every single compartment, but which doesn't exist. I'm gratified by the position on the history staff. We are growing. We are being asked intelligent questions about the lessons of history from very senior people. I am now working on a classified study of the development after 9/11 of a particular technical capability that's really cool, but it's really classified. And there's the good things about that story, and there are not so good things about that story, and I'm going to put it out there. Now, that said, there have been people in the agency leadership who don't necessarily want to hear about all the warts. I once gave this presentation, the classified version, to a cleared audience, and there were people from public affairs there. I don't know why they were there. Nothing to do. But I got pulled aside later and said, Nick, you're putting the doom in Dujmovic here. We're using the F word, failures, way too much. I said, well, I kind of tarted it up on the success side. What are you talking about? So I think, like as I said early on, we are the truth tellers to the truth tellers. We're going to have to be grown up about it and say we're not perfect and we've made some major mistakes, and look at those mistakes and see how we can do better, because the nation's relying on us, and that's not rhetoric. Well, I thank you. It's always stimulating beyond words to come to BYU, and I appreciate your attention, your questions. Thank you.